world, Venezuela has largely fallen off the map. Their exports are now down below 500,000 barrels a day. They've basically become a non-factor. The skill sets have atrophied. They haven't trained anyone new in the last 10 years. A lot of the skill set folks have left. And in fact, in order to pay its back debts to Russia's Lukoil and Rosneft, they had to hand over control of Citgo, the American refining company. And the Americans basically had a very quiet conversation with Moscow, like, just so you know, you got two choices here. You can give that back or we'll take it. And so it was given back last week. So Citgo is back in American hands. The question is how to divvy up the shares among people who are owed money by either the Russians or Venezuelans. So we've actually had, stealthily, the largest nationalization in American post-World War II history, very much under the radar. We're building a couple small new ones, but what's really happening is the existing footprint of the existing refinery stock is all being expanded. So we've added roughly 4 to 5 million barrels per day of distillation capacity over the last 7 years. And that's in addition to a little bit of distillation that we're doing in order to prep our light sweet crude for export. We pull out some of the natural gas liquids to process them locally. So we're doing it, we're just not increasing the number of refineries, we're just increasing their overall capacity. There's an argument to be made that the American Northeast and California really do need to break ground on some new refineries, but until we make it legal to ship crude from the American mid-continent there, that's probably not going to happen. We've got this weird law called the Jones Act that says that any cargo shipped between any two American ports has to be on a vessel that was built in America, is crewed by Americans, is captained by an American, and is owned by Americans. And any foreign ship that comes in, once they drop or pick up cargo in a specific port, they then have to go to a different country before they can come back to a different port. And we made it very difficult for us to ship product within our own system, or even crude within our own system. If you're in Texas, this is broadly working for you because it means you've got a captive market. You get as much of the crude as you want, but it does raise unnecessarily the cost for energy products on the coasts. In terms of other energy output, Chinese output continues to decline. Middle Eastern output is stable, kind of. There's been a lot of news recently that there's more Iranian crude hitting the market. That is not true. What's happened is that some of the Iranian crude that was using black market methods of avoiding the sanctions have now found gray market methods of avoiding the sanctions, and so it's a little bit more visible. That's the only difference there. Saudi Arabia has reduced its output by another 1 million barrels per day, or at least they say they're going to. Look at what they actually do. The last time they said they were going to cut output by 1 million, they actually raised it by 250,000 barrels. Saudi's playing a weird game here. They know now, it's really sunk in, that the Americans don't like them very much and that the Americans will never fight a war for them. And since we were their security guarantor for the last 70 years, they need a new one. So they are experimenting with different players, the French, the Brits, the Turks, the Chinese, the Japanese, in order to find someone who might fight for their ability to be fat and live in air conditioning. It hasn't gone great. Let's start in wind. The American Southwest is one of the top 3 solar zones in the world, and the American Great Plains are one of 2 great wind zones in the world. And so these are areas that, even with existing technology, assuming no improvements in transmission or storage, already makes sense to deploy mass volumes of capital to generate electricity in those 2 areas with those 2 technologies. Now, one of the things that the Inflation Reduction Act, an act that has nothing to do with inflation, does is it expands credit access to generation systems in the green tech space, and that vastly improves the economics for solar and wind in the United States outside of those 2 zones. So they've basically doubled, maybe even increased by 2.5 times, the land area of the United States where solar and wind make a great deal of sense. So just with this one law, we have probably enabled the United States to get roughly 1/4, maybe as much as 1/3 of their electricity from solar and wind 10 years from now. That's a really big step forward, whether you're green or you just like the math of getting free electricity. That's really helped. Nowhere else in the world near populated centers has that kind of advantage outside of Australia. And I broadly don't have a problem with that. Now, that doesn't mean that these areas are going 100% green. although places where it overlaps, like West Texas, very well may. But it does push us a lot more in the direction of energy security and a less carbon intensive system. They're not perfect technologies, but for these geographies, they're pretty close. And I've forgotten what the other two questions were. AI. I'd hate to be a copy editor right now. There are a lot of value-added industries that are really focused on rote memorization, and grammar is one of those skills where AI is proving very successful. For those of you in the legal profession, I'd hate to be a paralegal right now because a lot of that supporting network that requires the ability to go and research mass volumes of case studies, AI can do that with a few clicks. So productivity in these sectors may advance so quickly that we just don't need as many people in those sectors. Now, this doesn't overly concern me from an employment point of view, because anyone who has the tenacity to be an English major or paralegal can very easily retrain on different skills. These are people with pretty flexible minds. But for the moment, the only sectors where I see AI really digging in are things like that. It is possible that if we fast forward 5 years, that list will expand to include things like engineering and design. We're not there yet. It's not guaranteed that we will get there. And remember, we're going to have a shortage of chips that are necessary to drive this development at scale anyway. But people who do tax filings, this is probably something that is going to be heavily disrupted. People who are looking for accuracy in documents, same thing. I think the space that's going to be impacted the biggest, though, is political advertisements. Because let's be honest, those haven't exactly been fact forward until now. And you throw the speed of AI and its ability to speak to a person. One of the things that Karl Rove showed us is that if you have enough data on an individual voter, you can tailor conversations. So one of the things that Rove said to me when I met him a few years ago was, we now have 600 data points on most people in our database. We know, for example, what the race is, what side of the street they live in, what their purchasing patterns are. So the example he gave is like, what if you've got an African-American single mother of two who works 2 jobs, who lives on a south-facing apartment on the 3rd floor? You then look through your own network for another African-American mother of 2 who works 2 jobs, who also lives on a south-facing apartment on the 3rd floor, and you put them in touch so they can talk politics. AI can now do that in seconds across millions of potential voters. That changes the game a little bit, and it makes propaganda a lot more powerful. The Republican Party in the format that it existed in pre-Trump is not coming back. The populists that have pledged their loyalty to Trump are not pledging them to Republican values, they're pledging their loyalty to Trump personally. And it's become such a cult of personality that it doesn't matter what Trump does. They don't care who else is in the party. They don't care what he says or does or is caught doing or admits to. He is a lock. Now, one of the things that we saw is that he can't possibly win the general election. Before the indictments, when we had the midterms, which we were expecting to be a red wave that wasn't, the reason was independents showed up in numbers. Now, independents usually don't vote in midterm elections. They usually only vote in the generals. And they usually have some serious buyer's remorse. They tend to vote against whoever won the last time. And if you polled the independents after the midterm vote, they, by very strong numbers, said that they personally found Biden's economic management of the country to be disastrous, especially for them personally. But they still massively voted for Democrats.